Thanks, Adrian. Hi, everyone again. So this next part of today's session, as we jump into the content, is an introduction to climate change. So some people may be familiar with the concept of climate change, others may not be. But for the purposes of our workshop today, it's good to get everyone a kind of foundational and introductory understanding of what climate change is and what it means. And to start off, we're going to play a video that's going to help explain some of the basics. So hopefully all of you can hear and see this clearly.
As the sun's rays reach the Earth's surface, some are absorbed and re-emitted as heat. Greenhouse gases, such as water vapor and carbon dioxide, absorb and re-radiate some of this heat. Increased amounts of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere mean more heat is trapped, warming the Earth. Human activities, especially the burning of fossil fuels, have increased concentrations of atmospheric carbon dioxide by 40%, mainly since 1900. Global average surface temperature has increased by 0.8 degrees Celsius over that time. Other changes to the climate in recent decades can be seen in the warming of the oceans, a rise in sea level, decreasing snow and ice cover in the northern hemisphere, and a decline in sea ice in the Arctic. If emissions continue unchecked, then further warming of 2.6 to 4.8 degrees Celsius would be expected by the end of this century. Even at the low end, this would have serious implications for human societies and the natural world. For more information about climate change from leading science academies, please visit royalsociety.org.
All right, so that's a quick introduction into, a quick video just to provide a brief introduction to climate change. So hopefully all of you could hear that clearly and see the video. We're going to go deeper into some of those concepts in a couple of slides. But before we do dive into that, I wanted to show the slide on from the World Economic Forum Global Risk Report. The World Economic Forum does this report annually, and some of you may have seen it before, but it's compiled by taking the opinions of business leaders, politicians, and many other leaders across the world to ask them what do they see as their top risks coming, that's going to affect their businesses and their investments. So here you can see it's highlighted that climate action failure is in the top risks by likelihood and top risks by impact. And this has been coming up year after year. And if I highlight all the risks that's been related to climate change, you can see that this map starts to get quite scary. So clearly, climate change and the risks from climate change are top of mind of business leaders and other leaders globally. So it's important for us to have these conversations and these workshops, and for people and asset owners like yourselves and custodians of assets to also factor into your decision-making how to manage and mitigate climate change and the impacts of climate change. Onto some key foundational concepts again. So if we look at what are the sources and sinks of carbon, here we can see that fossil fuel and industry is a major source of carbon. That means these industries have been emitting lots of tons of carbon. And another big source of carbon is the change in land use. So agriculture, deforestation, this is resulting in many, many tons of carbon being emitted into the atmosphere. So those are the two major sources. That's the fossil fuels, which provide our energy and transportation, as well as land use change, so deforestation and agriculture. But there are also sinks of carbon. These are our natural resources, like our landscapes and our natural plants and vegetation and trees. They act as sinks of carbon, so they suck out carbon out of the atmosphere and store it within the soil. And similarly, the ocean is also a store of carbon. Phytoplankton and other organisms within the ocean, they suck out carbon out of the atmosphere and store it. So it's important that we protect our land. It's important that we protect our ocean, as these are critical sinks and critical parts of our natural environment, keeping our ecological systems in balance. As mentioned in the video, greenhouse gases are gases that are emitted from human activity, and these include carbon-based gases such as carbon dioxide as well as methane. And while they're vital to the Earth's atmosphere in certain quantities, they also trap heat and retain the sun's heat, as mentioned in the video, causing a greenhouse gas effect. Important to understand in the concept of carbon dioxide emissions or methane emissions, commonly referred to as greenhouse gas emissions, are Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions. Now, these are referring to the emissions of a company, and the Scope 1 emissions, the Scope 1 greenhouse gas emissions refer to those emissions, carbon dioxide emissions or methane emissions or other greenhouse gas emissions that result from activities under the direct control of a company. So these could include the burning of fossil fuels on site of the operations of a company, either through gas boilers or other on-site energy generation. It also includes the vehicles part of a fleet of a companies, as well as air conditioning. The Scope 2 emissions refer to the emissions that result from purchasing electricity. So every company uses electricity. They usually purchase that from Eskom, and there's associated greenhouse gas emissions from purchasing that electricity, because as we all know, Eskom uses coal to produce most of its electricity, and therefore coal as a fossil fuel results in a lot of CO2 emissions when you burn it. Scope 3 emissions are all the other indirect emissions from the activities of a company that they do not control. So these are associated with the procurement of the company. When you buy goods and services from other service providers, those entail certain emissions. So for example, if you buy a can of paint, that paint must come from somewhere. There are certain emissions associated with producing that paint. And because a company purchased that, those emissions associated with that particular can of paint are part of the Scope 3 emissions that the company is responsible for. Scope 3 emissions are also important for financial institutions because they include the emissions that result from the company's lending and investing activities. So if an investor or asset manager or a bank has loaned or invested money in a company that's, let's say, in the mining industry, and that mining company then emits certain tons of carbon dioxide, a portion of that is allocated to the issuer of the, or to the financial institution as a provider of capital, as a owner of that business, as a lender to that business. A portion of that emissions is allocated under Scope 3 emissions to the financial institutions. Now, in the climate change sphere, many people talk about 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees. Now, this concept refers to the increase in temperature above the pre-industrial levels. So in that video that we showed earlier, they were talking about the 1800s and even the 1700s, which is the pre-industrial revolution. So if we look at pre-industrial human society, what was the temperature then? We're now in a position where we're around 1 to 1.3 degrees warmer, and we're fast approaching 1.5 degrees, and we could be even on track to go over 2 degrees. And in South Africa, we know that our country is particularly warming faster than the rest of the world, so we'll be on track for 3 degrees warmer than pre-industrial society. And this slide is showing you what the impacts of a 1.5 degree warmer world would be and what the impacts of a 2 degree warmer world would be. So we would see that there'd be 100% increase in flood risk on a 1.5-degree scenario, and a 170% increase in flood risk under a 2-degree scenario. We'll see that species will decline, water availability will reduce. And we know in South Africa, as a water scarce country, this is even scarier for us. We know that sea levels will rise, Arctic sea ice will melt faster. There'll be an impact on people as well, as 9% of the world's population in a 1.5-degree warmer scenario will be exposed to extreme heat weather at least once every 20 years. Whereas under a 2-degree scenario, 28% of people of the world's population will be exposed to extreme heat waves at least once every 20 years. This is also going to impact food. Every half a degree warmer we go above the pre-industrial levels of temperature will lead to lower yields and lower nutritional content in our food supply. So these are all very worrying risks that society faces. And as the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the UN IPCC, released in their special report on 1.5 degrees, they show that it's important and quite urgent the need to keep the planet below 1.5 degree in order to still live in a sustainable and comfortable way. So the need for action is quite urgent. Another concept that's important to understand is the idea of a carbon budget. So we can only emit so much of carbon before we start to see the planet going above 1.5 degree, going above 2 degrees. So to stabilize the planet at only 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels, so at 1.5 degrees warmer, for a 67% chance, we can only emit 400 gigatons of CO2, and that is ever. For a 50% chance, so we lower the probability, then we can emit a bit more. But we see in terms of 2018 emissions, so that's the amount of emissions globally that we've emitted in the year 2018, for a 67% chance of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees, we only have 12 years of 2018 emissions left. So that's our carbon budget. We can only emit in the rest of our lives and future 12 years of 2018. So that's how much we have left under our carbon budget in order to stabilize our global climate at 1.5 degrees. So that's the concept of the carbon budget. Now, fossil fuels is extremely important in the conversation around climate change. Why? Because if we look at our fossil fuel reserves, and this map on the slide is showing you all the different countries and their fossil fuel reserves, which include oil, natural gas, coal. If we had to use up all our fossil fuel reserves, we will well overshoot our carbon budget. So we will well go over a 1.5 degree, 2 degree, even 3 or 4 degree warmer society, which is not good for our planet. It's not good for society. And the risks that were shown on the previous slide will be even more exacerbated. So now a little poll to kind of engage with you guys. We want to get a sense from our participants today, but how confident would you feel in engaging in a discussion on climate risks? So would you be not confident at all, confident, not confident at all, or not confident, confident, or very confident? So if you could respond to that poll, we would really appreciate getting an understanding from the audience today about where your understanding of climate change is. All right, so it looks like the couple of people who have responded are not really different. So hopefully at the end of the session, we can change that. Thank you, Sofako, for this poll, and thank you to those who responded to the poll. We've got another video here to help explain some more concepts on climate change. So hopefully you guys can see this all clearly, and it will help you become a bit more confident in understanding climate change.
Human activities, from pollution to overpopulation,
Sorry about that.
are driving up the Earth's temperature and fundamentally changing the world around us. The main cause is a phenomenon known as the greenhouse effect. Gases in the atmosphere, such as water vapor, carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and chlorofluorocarbons, let the sun's light in, but keep some of the heat from escaping, like the glass walls of a greenhouse. The more greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, the more heat gets trapped, strengthening the greenhouse effect and increasing the Earth's temperature. Human activities, like the burning of fossil fuels, have increased the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere by more than a third since the Industrial Revolution. The rapid increase in greenhouse gases in the atmosphere has warmed the planet at an alarming rate. While Earth's climate has fluctuated in the past, atmospheric carbon dioxide hasn't reached today's levels in hundreds of thousands of years. Climate change has consequences for our oceans, our weather, our food sources, and our health. Ice sheets, such as Greenland and Antarctica, are melting. The extra water that was once held in glaciers causes sea levels to rise and spills out of the oceans, flooding coastal regions. Warmer temperatures also make weather more extreme. This means not only more intense major storms, floods, and heavy snowfall, but also longer and more frequent droughts. These changes in weather pose challenges. Growing crops becomes more difficult. The areas where plants and animals can live shift, and water supplies are diminished. In addition to creating new agricultural challenges, climate change can directly affect people's physical health. In urban areas, the warmer atmosphere creates an environment that traps and increases the amount of smog. This is because smog contains ozone particles, which increase rapidly at higher temperatures. Exposure to higher levels of smog can cause health problems such as asthma, heart disease, and lung cancer. While the rapid rate of climate change is caused by humans, humans are also the ones who can combat it. If we work to replace fossil fuels with renewable energy sources like solar and wind, which don't produce greenhouse gas emissions, we might still be able to prevent some of the worst effects of climate change.
Okay, so that was the second video on climate change. Hopefully it's improving you guys' understanding of climate change as we go. I hope you enjoyed that. So the next part of today's introduction to climate change section is on climate policy. Before I go into that, I just want to check if there's any questions or any comments from the participants today. You're welcome to just jump in or put it into the chat. So if you have any questions for myself on what's been presented so far, please go ahead and ask. If not, it looks like there doesn't seem to be any questions. No further comments in the chat. I'll move forward onto the climate policy part of this introduction into climate change. And it's important we talk about climate policy because this is a key part of the climate transition risks, which we'll get into a bit later. If we look here, this is from an organization called the Climate Action Tracker. They are showing the historical emissions globally, and well as including what are the pledges that were made at the Paris Agreement, through the Paris Agreement. So at the Conference of Parties in 2017 on climate change, most of the global community came together and signed and agreed to the Paris Agreement in order to take action to limit climate change to a 2-degree target. And if you look at the pledges here, you'll see that there's the old pledges and the new pledges, and that there's a gap between the two. And we know that the pledges themselves were not strong enough to limit the carbon emissions and to be strong enough action that we needed to limit between 1.5 degree or warmer society. So we expect to see stronger policies and more rapid transition towards a climate secure future. So we can expect stronger policies to come from governments across the world, including South Africa, where in South Africa there has been a lot of progress on climate change. The slide is showing you this, and it might be a bit text heavy, but the point of this slide is to talk about the long-term adaptation flagship research program, or the LTAS, which was coordinated by the Department of Environmental Affairs. And there is a number of research products and white papers and committees and working groups preparing stuff to support the policy space and landscape in South Africa. So we can expect to see more and more regulation, more and more policy to come in the South African space. Just like the carbon tax. Now, South Africa has implemented a carbon tax, and there's been a carbon tax that's been implemented or is being scheduled for implementation across the world. So if you've got investments in South Africa, you might want to look at them from a carbon tax and perspective, as well as from a policy perspective, how the new policies are going to affect your investments. But if you've got investments overseas and offshore, again, you can see that carbon taxes and carbon policies and climate change policies are going to be implemented across the globe, which is going to impact investments in South Africa and offshore. And many countries have already set ambitious net zero targets. So that means they're going to be pushing the policy space quite hard to get companies and organizations to reduce their emissions quite substantially as we try to target net zero by 2050. What that means is countries want to get to a point where the amount of carbon that they're emitting is equal to the amount of carbon that they manage to suck out of the atmosphere through new technologies or through reforestation or through different kinds of carbon capture storage. So these are going to impact your investments in South Africa as well as your investments offshore. Next part of this introductory session on climate change is just to talk about some useful tools. The water risk filter is one tool where you can look at what the impact of your operations are going to be from a water perspective and a spatial perspective. So you can plug in your location of a certain factory or a certain plant or a certain agriculture or a certain mining operation. And then you can put that address in and get a sense of what the water risks are. And these water risks, of course, are to climate change. As the videos have mentioned, as I've mentioned, with the links to climate change and water are quite strong. And South Africa being a water scarce country, this is quite a useful tool for people to understand their exposures to water risk. The Green Book was produced by the CSIR, that's the Council for Scientific Research, and it's available at thegreenbook.co.za, where one can look at the municipalities in South Africa to get an understanding of their risk profiles as it relates to climate change. So you can check that website out to look at any potential municipalities and get a sense of if you've got any businesses there, if you've got any mining operations, agriculture operations, any industry in any certain municipalities in South Africa. This can give you quite a nice view on that. Important for the attendees today and for the audience for labor is around the commodities and industries in South Africa that are exposed to climate change risk. And this was a resource that's produced by NBI, BUSA, and Boston Consulting Group that is talking about how the decarbonization of South Africa's power system will affect certain industries, from platinum to coal to iron ore, So different sectors are exposed to different levels of climate change risk. And this was some really good research done by NBI and BCG on the transition to a more sustainable future, and the industries that are and will be exposed to certain risks. WWF also produced a report called the Low Carbon Sunrise for the Mining Industry, which also highlights significant certain sectors that will be exposed to the transition risks and that could suffer significant losses, financial impact losses from the transition to a more sustainable future. Here again, we're looking at the emissions from each sector. It's produced by that same report that was shown previously. And you can see that the electricity production sector is by far responsible for the most emissions in South Africa, and therefore exposed to quite significant transition risk as we transition to a more sustainable future. And that's followed by petrochemicals, as well as the agriculture, forestry, and land use sectors. These are significant emitters of CO2 and therefore could be quite exposed to things like carbon taxes and other policies and new regulations that might come to bear in the future. Now, while there are tools and reports and websites that one can go and look at, there are also alliances of people coming together, such as the Alliance for Climate Action. So people can join this alliance to work together and collaborate with others on working on solutions for climate change. The Alliance for Climate Action is calling on companies and financial institutions to both work together, but also to make commitments to reduce their emissions to achieve net zero emissions by 2050, as well as take up a number of other activities to reduce the impacts and mitigate the risks of climate change. Now, while there are alliances where people come together, there's also an initiative put together called the Science-Based Targets Initiative, where the Science-Based Targets Initiative, which is created by CDP, the United Nations Global Compact, the World Resource Institute, and WWF. This is an initiative that helps companies in developing targets. So it's kind of like a combination of the tools, the alliances coming together to help companies develop targets. And we're going to talk a bit more about this in a later session today. Before jumping into the next session, we want to, again, get some engagement from you guys and hear and test and ask you another poll. So we want to ask, is the link between climate change and the impact on long-term investments clear to you? So it would be great if you can let us know what your feelings are on this. Okay, so we had one response so far. And yes, the links between climate change and impact on long-term investments is clear. We'll give it some more time just for get participants to engage with us. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love to know what you're thinking. Just going to give it a few more seconds here, but it's coming up that a couple of participants can clearly see the links between the impact between climate change and long-term investments, which is important for asset owners and asset managers and principal consultants and trustees to consider. Okay, so 3 participants, thank you so much for responding to the poll. It's great to get your feedback and great to know that you're still with us. And it seems that the link is clear for those participants, which is great. All righty, so thanks to those who participated. We'll move on to the next now. And I think the next part is for me to hand over to Adrian. And Adrian, I think there's another video coming, so I'll hand over to you and let me know when to